tonight we want to talk about the Quakers. And I know we always say we're going to do all these famous people, the Desert Mothers and Fathers, Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, and then we're doing the Quakers. A very mystical group of people, and it's sort of mysticism in today's world. At least that's how I'm looking at it. My plan tonight is I have slides, which I'll bring up in a minute, and then we're going to switch over to a video. Having never been to a Quaker meeting myself, I thought that we should hear the Quakers talking about a Quaker meeting and what their expectations are, and then come back and talk about what their vestry looks like, which I found fascinating, and then we'll have a conversation. But I decided I should start with a reading. And so I'm reading from this book by Thomas Kelly, who died in 1941, Quaker. And there's a story with him that when I first came to St. Paul's, Ann Burshopper said I should definitely read this book by Thomas Kelly. So being a book person, I went out and got it and read it. And it wasn't really until the end of the book that I realized I was reading a book by a Quaker. I thought he was Episcopalian. So anyway, shows you what I knew at that time. But this is a wonderful book. It's been printed like 8 times. It's still in print. So, but he has an area in this book called The Simplification of Life, which is always one of my hot topics. And I'll just read one paragraph as kind of an opening prayer. Do you want to live in such an amazing divine presence that life is transformed and transfigured and transmuted into peace and power and glory and miracle? If you do, then you can. But if you say you haven't the time to go down into the recreating silences, I can only say to you, then you don't really want to. You don't yet love God above all else in the world, with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. For except for spells of sickness in the family, or when the children are small, when terrific pressure comes upon us, we find time for what we really want to do. And I always found that paragraph challenging for us. And I decided to title this An Episcopalian Looks at the Quakers, because I felt like, as I'm looking at this active working faith, I felt like a charlatan or something, trying to make claims about the Quakers when I've only read a lot of books about the Quakers. So my plan for the evening is to talk about a very brief history of the beginnings of the Quaker movement, and then tell their story through some noteworthy people as we go through time, talk a little bit about beliefs and practices, and then about their meetings. And they call everything a meeting. So there are meetings for worship, meetings for business, yearly meetings. What are all the meetings about? So a very brief history. The Quakers and a lot of other splinter groups came about during the English Civil War. So we're talking 1650 or so. As we know, Oliver Cromwell's parliamentary forces won the battle. And there were many arguments in their ranks and in the country as a whole as to what were the rights of the commonest he in the realm. That was their language. So for the farmers and the shopkeepers and whatever, what was going to be the right of the common man? Up until this time, the nobility were the only people who were worth anything, who had any rights. So so during this time, there was all of these political implications of a spiritual view of man and man's freedom to worship God in any pattern he was inwardly drawn to follow. And, 1650 would be about 100 years after Henry VIII. So there would still be this turmoil. There was Elizabeth, and then, Mary, or Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth, the toing and froing. So a lot of topsy-turvy going on in the English church. But 4 decades after 1650, so around 1690, there were 75,000 Quakers between Britain and America. So the noteworthy friends, and I'm thinking of Society of Friends, that we'll talk about are George Fox, Isaac Penington, William Penn, Carolyn Stephen, Rufus Jones, and Thomas Kelly. So our first person up is George Fox, who is thought to be the founder of the Quakers. And in the beginning, the Quakers were actually it was sort of a term of derision by the rest of Britain about these people who were not following any rule of order in their church. They refused to doff their hats to people who were socially superior to them. They were not well loved at all. So he was one of the primary dissenters. He rebelled against religious and political authorities by proposing an unusual, uncompromising approach to Christian faith. So the idea of sitting in silence and waiting for God to speak to an individual member or the community as a whole was so far away, with no liturgy, no prayer, no preacher, none of that, was so far away from the Church of England services that everybody was required to go to. He traveled throughout Britain as a dissenting preacher, performing hundreds of healings, and often persecuted. He actually was jailed, 6 or 8 times, something like that, really poor conditions. In those early years, a lot of people were persecuted, and a lot of the early community was really about supporting families of men and women who had been thrown in jail or killed, or whatever bad had happened to them, but supporting those communities. But George was viewed with respect by William Penn and Oliver Cromwell. And there's a story about Oliver Cromwell that says that he told, so here he is, he's won this battle, he's victorious, and he has told the people around him that he will see any visitor who comes, because he thinks that God is going to speak to him through a visitor, and he doesn't want to miss an opportunity for God to speak to him, which sounds a lot like what the Quakers were talking about at that time. I found that surprising. And I put some quotes in for some of these people. And these quotes about George Fox are really, William Penn was an early Quaker. He put together George Fox's journals. And in his preface, he said a couple of things about George Fox. So one was, he's civil beyond all forms of breeding. In his behavior, very temperate, eating little and sleeping less, though a bulky person. And a second after he had died, thus he lived and sojourned among us, and as he lived, so he died, feeling the same eternal power that had raised and preserved him in his last moments. So full of assurance was he that he triumphed over death, and so even to the last, as if death were hardly worth notice or mention. So he lived his life as though that life were that he had to live a good life. That was going to be what he had going forward, and so he cherished every day. So next we'll talk about Isaac Penington. He is a little older than George Fox, but came in to the Quakers a little bit later on. The oldest son of a Puritan and Lord Mayor of London, Isaac Penington Sr., so one of the upper crust. His stepdaughter married William Penn, so that's the connection with Penn. He was convinced at that point that the Quaker faith was true, and so he and his wife joined in 1657 or 58, so in his middle age. But he was very well educated, so he became an influential promoter and defender of the movement, writing extensively. His complete works were published in 1681 and are still in print today, supposedly, although I did not find them, so maybe in England. And a couple of quotes from him from letters to people, and I'm not sure who the people are, but the quotes were great. So to someone named Thomas Walmsley, "O friend, I beseech thee, mind this. Come, O come to the true root. Come to Christ indeed. Rest not in an outward knowledge, but come to the inward life, the hidden life, and receive life from him who is the life, and then abide in and live to God in the life of his Son." So the worship of Jesus is very much in the center of their tradition. And another quote from a letter to Dulcibella Leighton: "Come out of the knowledge and comprehension about things into the feeling life, and let that be thy knowledge and wisdom, which thou receivest and retainest in the feeling life, and that will lead thee into the footsteps of the flock without reasoning, consulting, or disputing." And now we come to William Penn, 1644 to 1718. He was, again, upper echelon, son of an admiral and politician. He ended up, as we know, founding what became Pennsylvania, and he received the land because King Charles II owed debts to his father. And when his father died, then William Penn, our William Penn, went to collect those debts, and he was given a large tract of land in North America near the Atlantic coast. That happened in 1681. The next year, he traveled to this new land, and the first Pennsylvania General Assembly was held there, and a new constitution was adopted. And as we know from our world or our country's history, that new constitution included freedom of religion. Many Quakers had already come to the new land. They were in New England and were being persecuted along with all of the other non-Puritan religions. And so William Penn felt like having a place for them would be the right thing to do, and he carried on. So Penn supported the unification of the colonies. The democratic principles that he had set forth in the Pennsylvania frame of government served as an inspiration for the framers of the Constitution in 1787. So from what I've read, the whole idea of freedom of religion in the country as a whole really grew out of that initial constitution written by William Penn for Pennsylvania. Next we have Carolyn Stephen, because I thought we should have a woman, and she's was the only woman in the list. So we moved up quite a ways, 100 years. 1834 to 1909 are her dates. Daughter of abolitionists Sir James and Catherine Stephen. She joined the Quakers in 1879, and in 1890 published something called Quaker Strongholds. it was received as a classic, and this made her the most well-known female Quaker, and I love this quote, amongst those who read books. And interesting, and this is sort of an aside and doesn't have anything to do with our topic tonight, but her niece was Virginia Woolf, and Caroline left Virginia Woolf 2,500 pounds on her death, and that gave Woolf the resources to write, so otherwise we might not have known her. And her quote came from a letter to a friend, it didn't say who. Some such vague impression floated, I believe, over my own mind when, some 17 years ago, I first found myself within reach of a friend's meeting, and somewhat to my surprise, cordially made welcome to attend it. The invitation came at a moment of need, for I was beginning to feel with dismay that I might not much longer be able conscientiously to continue to join in the Church of England service. So a lot of toing and froing going on even at this time. And the one thing I want to say now is that the Quakers are not one thing, they are many things. And I started looking them up and putting a whole section in about all the divisions, but then realized that this was going to go on for 3 hours. So I will just mention that there are significant divisions. One, at the American Revolutionary War, some American Quakers split over issues such as support for the war, forming groups such as the Free Quakers and the Universal Friends. So those are names of 2 other societies. And then in the 19th century, there was a diversification of theological beliefs in the Religious Society of Friends. And this led to several larger splits within the Quaker movement. If you're interested in this, on Wikipedia, there's this big chart of kind of when people split off and what the names of these different organizations are. Interestingly, or maybe not, or maybe we would expect this, is on the East Coast, is all, if not maybe mostly, that traditional Quaker meeting of the sort that came over from England in the beginning, although they continually listen for God's word to change and update and be addressing the issues of the day. So the meetings that we see around us, like here in Rochester, kind of what I imagine Quaker meetings to be. Some of the other divisions have church services with hymnals and bulletins and a preacher and all of that sort of stuff, which is not really what I think of when I think of the Quakers. So the next name is Rufus Jones, who is pretty modern, died in 1948, very well known. Actually, Thomas Kelly, who we'll talk about a little bit next, was a student of Rufus Jones at Haverford College. He worked hard to soothe some of these splits from the 19th century and had some success with that. But he wrote extensively on the topic of mysticism, which is one of the chief aspects of the Quaker faith. So, you know, so the mystics are among us, and we, at least we can, I'm sure we can find Episcopalian mystics, but we can find them at the Quaker Meeting House. And a quote from him from a book he wrote, The Faith and Practice of the Quakers. It exhibits a warm and intimate type of inward religion. It is broad, inclusive, and tolerant. It cares intensively for religious experience and discounts those aspects of religion which are argumentative, speculative, and divisive. It has preserved a good degree of evangelical fervor without becoming seriously entangled in the network of theology that often goes with the doctrinal word evangelical. It is kept pretty close to the central meaning of the incarnation, the definite breaking in of God into the course of history, the coming of eternity into the midst of time in the form of a living, visible, human, divine person, through whom all life on its highest levels is to be interpreted. But it discovers no temporal end to that life here in the world. The Christ who was a visible presence in Galilee and Judea is just as certainly alive and present now. This idea that if God spoke to us in the past, it must be possible that he speaks to us even today. So my last person is Thomas Kelly, who is spoken of as the brother Lawrence of our time. Oh, there's a typo I missed. You know, and a quote to the right there, now is the dwelling place of God himself. And he would argue that dwelling place is within each of us. But a little following a crushing disappointment in the late autumn of 1937, Thomas Kelly was swept by an experience of the presence where, in his own words, he tells us that he was literally melted down by the love of God. During the next 3 years, he poured out the prophetic insights that he had experienced and did so with unmistakable authenticity. And these were edited into a book called A Testament of Devotion. And that book that I read originally when I came to St. Paul's. He quoted Meister Eckhart, which I thought was interesting given that we talked about him 2 weeks ago. Meister Eckhart wrote, "As thou art in church or cell, that same frame of mind carry out into the world, into its turmoil and its fitfulness. Deep within us all, there is an amazing inner sanctuary of the soul, a holy place, a divine center, a speaking voice, to which we may continuously return. Eternity is at our hearts, pressing upon our time-torn lives, warming us with intimations of an astounding destiny, calling us home unto itself." So I think that gives you a flavor of how Quakers have spoken about their faith traditions and their experiences over time. The next book, a friend of mine gave me this. It's Guide to Quaker Practice. It was written, it's published by Pendle Hill, one of the Quaker schools, and it cost 45 cents. So you can see how old it was. And according to this, under belief, there are two kinds of beliefs within the Quaker community. And the first is those which condition Christian behavior in general and are shared by other Christians, is the first kind. And the second kind, and those which give rise to unique practices, such as this silent meeting and many other things you'll see. Quakers have not issued statements of belief, reasoning that no form of words can adequately convey the living, growing truth of the Christian religion. There's an interesting statement from the beginning where somebody like 4 or 5 years in wrote a document that he claimed was a statement of belief for the Quakers. And other Quakers sort of scoffed at him and said, well, that's because he went to Oxford. You know, it's those old days, it has nothing to do with being a Quaker. So the idea that you would actually write down what this faith tradition was extremely foreign. The New Testament is revered as a divine revelation of truth, but it must be understood as a whole and not through isolated texts. But often as you're reading about the Quakers, you read about the Acts of the Apostles, and particularly when the Holy Spirit came down and had people speaking in different voices, that really is part of their rationale for thinking that God is speaking, believing strongly that God is speaking to them today. Their practices. So the Society of Friends accepts into membership a person who is willing to follow the Quaker method, regardless of where it may lead. And there's a name for this, but I can't remember what it is, unfortunately. The Quaker bases its practices on belief in a God-centered spiritual universe, the inner truth and meaning of which is in some degree accessible to man. And the Quakers have accepted a certain body of religious and social doctrines inherited from the past and subject always to new interpretations as more truth is apprehended. So this idea that I am always making the word of God be viable, be current with today's questions. And now we'll talk about meetings, but I want to go to talk about a worship meeting. I want to listen to the Quakers. So I'm going to stop this share and then go to the video.
Quakers believe that if you want to find out what God has to say, you need to listen. And so we spend a lot of time listening in quiet prayer. And that quiet prayer time, which can happen anytime, anywhere, is the heart of the Quaker religious experience.
If you are going to go into Quaker meeting for the first time, first of all, congratulations. So you walk in, sit down, be quiet. What you expect when you're there, besides that you're just go with the flow, is different things depending on where you are.
Unlike some other churches, you don't need to dress up with a suit and tie or a fancy dress. Most of the folks come in jeans, t-shirts, or shorts, t-shirts, whatever you're comfortable in.
So you're thinking about coming to meeting and you have children. You really need to know that you have to bring them. They may or may not enjoy themselves, but the community is we're always so thrilled to have young people join us. They come and they're bringing their aliveness and their love and their genuineness. So please, bring them. They are welcome. So if you come into this space and you're looking for images or maybe words on the walls, some kind of direction, and you're going to notice that there isn't going to be any there. From the very beginning of Quakerism, it's about the inside. So it's about you not looking around you for that, but really going inward for your own wisdom, for your own piece of the divine that's been given to you.
Sometimes a worship room will look like a really old building with benches that have been sat on by thousands of Quakers over hundreds of years. And sometimes it will look like the basement of another local church. Something that's common to them is that people often will enter already in silence, find a place in the room, and sit down in silence. Anyone coming into the room can sit anywhere. There's not a right place or a wrong place to sit.
So before you go into meeting for worship for the first time, I'll tell you what I always told my kids when they were little every week before we went in, which is just remember when you go in to just sit down and listen for God, that God is here with us and this is a space to listen.
The first time I went to Quaker meeting, I didn't know how to listen because I'd never listened in church before. I had to work on that process of figuring out, what am I listening for? Am I listening to myself? What's going on? What is everyone else listening to, and how does that affect the community and me?
So in that quietness, you walk in, you say, okay, everybody's sitting there quietly. When are the directions going to come? What am I going to do? Just follow suit. You sit down.
Just sit down and be in that space and feel the space and the people around you, and open yourself as much as you can. Just continue to notice how you can be aware of all that's around you and all that's within you, and how that's all connected to everybody else in the room.
It's called unprogrammed worship because there's no sermon, there's no hymns, no Bible readings. no prayers written out ahead of time. The whole idea of unprogrammed worship is to spend quiet time in prayer with our hearts and minds open to God.
If God has ever spoken, then God is still speaking. And expecting God to move through somebody, maybe through me, maybe not through me, maybe just internally and the message is just for me, maybe one that needs to be shared. And I think that is so provocative. It's provocative to say, like, there's no guidelines here. Like, what can I want to know what I'm expecting. And I don't know what I'm expecting every Sunday, but I know that I'm expecting.
Sometimes during that quiet time, people will feel moved to speak. It might be just a couple of words, or it might be several minutes. And then there'll be some more quiet time, and maybe later on someone else will speak. They might continue what the first person says, or they might go on in a different direction.
We've had people dance a message. We've had people walk a message. We've had people sing a message, in addition to the usual standing up and giving a verbal message.
And it might just be like that for an hour. And then what to expect at the end, it'll be like it's just somehow it just started happening. Everyone will start shaking hands.
Which sort of signifies the changing from the spiritual to the secular worlds of sorts.
And then we'll all be aware that that's happening and we'll follow suit. So all this handshaking is going to happen in this greeting.
Generally, Quakers have a litany of announcements of various activities that are going on, what protests were involved in this time around, or what good organizations to be part of, or or what potlucks are happening, things like that. And then usually Quakers gather for coffee, tea, catch up with each other, see how things are going on throughout the week. And
particularly when I'm new to a community, I tend to want to kind of like sneak in and sneak out again. And I find that it's a good discipline for me, that often there's all of this community building conversation activity that happens after worship, which is like really an important part of the worship experience. Building connections with one another that make the worship richer and deeper.
And that's about it. That's a Quaker meeting for worship.
So just a couple more things, but these fascinated me because I go, if these people are sitting in silence, there's no minister, preacher, whatever, rector, what we're used to. And so how does the business of the organization get carried on? And in the Quaker Spirituality book, in the introduction, is this story about business meetings that I thought would amuse perhaps some of you. And it says, "It is our hope that in our meetings, the will of God shall prevail rather than the desires of men. We do not set great store by rhetoric or clever argument. The mere gaining of debating points is found to be unhelpful and alien." Then it goes on to say, "The business meeting is presided over by a clerk who has been chosen by the meeting for a term of office. His role is quite different from that of a chairman who, with Robert's Rules of Order at his mental fingertips, handles motions, amendments from the floor, calls for divisions, counts, votes, etc. The Quaker clerk is ideally chosen from the most seasoned friends in the meeting. He is a good listener, has a clear mind that can handle issues, has the gift of preparing a written minute that can succinctly sum up the sense of the meeting, and is one who has faith in the presuppositions that were mentioned earlier. With all of this, a good clerk is a person who refuses to be hurried and can weary out dissensions with a practice born of the confidence that there is a way through, although the group may have to return to the issue meeting after meeting." And I thought, what an interesting way. I mean, it's sort of talking through issues until consensus arrives. And then the other kind of meeting is called a yearly meeting. And those tend to be sort of like our diocesan convention, maybe, but geographic areas. So there's a New England yearly meeting. There's kind of a mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, I believe, in kind of a mid-Atlantic yearly meeting where they come together once a year and they talk about how's it going. There are things called queries where they come to together to say, sort of, how are we doing? You know, are things going the way that God would like for them to go? And what are the changes perhaps that we should make? So quite a different polity in terms of how they function as a religion. And then my last slide is merely the resources that I used for this presentation. Amen.